Hello, beautiful people, and welcome back to another episode of First Generation Flyers, a limited series where I share my journey of recovery from emotional trauma to heal my soul. I'm your host, Vay, and this is your friendly reminder that I'm not a licensed professional, just sharing my personal experiences in hopes to help someone else find their wings. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the subliminal effects of a broken heart in the form of toxic behavior, aka heart and mind's love affair. In the last episode, we went beneath the surface to uncover Heart's origin stories and learned that her broken heart was inherited as a result of generational cycles of broken homes. Broken homes don't only occur when there's a physically absent parent. One can have both parents in a home and it still be broken if either of the hearts leading it are unwhole or unhealed. In some cases, you may have both parents physically present, but the toxic behavior of either or both may create an environment of chronic stress and anxiety, which weighs heavy on the hearts of the people in the home. This creates invisible pressure on them to absorb that stress by trying to keep the peace or by dissociating altogether if they don't have the mental capacity or psychological development to manage that stress. When the heart is broken by a significant relationship, be it a parent, a significant other, a child, or anyone else that holds a big piece of our hearts, the impacts can change the course of who we become. It can lead one to harbor feelings of anger and resentment for being left unprotected, or helplessness for not having a voice in the situation. And when those painful emotions are not processed in a healthy way, the ball of negative energy that situation then becomes finds a resting place in the seat of our hearts, ready to release the wrath of God whenever triggered. Depending on the severity and how much power that relationship holds over us, our souls may be torn into two, a higher self and a lower self. And depending on the influence of outside factors, our minds may become dissociated from our hearts in an attempt to avoid the painful emotions that come along with it. However, as we learned in the last episode, the heart is the bridge between the physical and spiritual worlds, and the key that unlocks the gate to our invisible selves. So when the mind is dissociated from the heart, those balls of negative energy created from unprocessed emotions become the invisible driving force that directs our path in life, leaving us at a loss for why our decisions and choices don't add up to the life we've envisioned for ourselves. And when this happens, one of two things will likely occur. You'll either change what you want in life by adjusting your expectations to the limitations of your heart, or you'll drive yourself crazy by trying to force a life that your heart doesn't want. And that is the basic recipe for unhappiness and toxic behavior. Basic needs is the underground level. This is where our habits, instincts, and survival skills are formed and where the foundation of our personalities are created. When we talk about genetics and heredity, it's at this level where traits are passed down from parents or caregivers to offspring over time. At the lowest stage of basic needs, which is physiological needs, food, water, warmth, and rest, the absence of fathers in my family resulted in overworked mothers who had to be everything to everyone all at a time, leaving no room to be anything to themselves. And this cultivated an environment of chronic stress. The stress of having to be everything to everyone, including the sole provider and protector to make their children feel safe, was physically, mentally, and emotionally demanding. They were pouring from an empty well, trying to hide the pain of a broken heart that wouldn't heal, all in hopes that their flowers would bloom. But most children can see through the smoke and mirrors as they are the closest thing to the source of life. And they may begin to take on those burdens to lighten the load of a parent who's already doing too much, or look to something or someone else to fill that gap. PTSD as a result of unresolved trauma created a belief that avoidance equated to safety. At the safety needs stage, health, personal, emotional, and financial security, turning a blind eye to the emotional impacts of trauma conditioned us to believe that our emotions were not a priority because the environment in which the trauma existed was unchanging. This created a false sense of security, deep trust issues, and was the plight of growing up on survival. Decades of research in the psychology field on family interactions conclude that most of our psychological characteristics are influenced to some degree by genes, and that human behavior also shows signs of genetic influence. So that means how we manage and react to stress, how we care for others and ourselves, and how we generally cope with life can be partially attributed to our genetic makeup, or the influences of our parents and other family members. The other piece of that is our respective environments and individual life experiences that build on top of it. The most valuable trait my mother instilled in me was a love for education, which is the foundation for independence. As she built herself from the ground up, I was right there in the shadows absorbing her every move. I went with her to school, on some occasions to work, and watched her monetize off creations that she built from scratch. She was a crafter, and there was nothing that this woman couldn't do. She was my role model. But while these tools prepared me for life and taught me how to survive on my own, they failed to address the needs of my broken heart. My mother was highly intelligent and knowledgeable about everything, except for when it came to matters of the heart, or at least my heart. Some days, it was almost as if her heart and mine were in two different places. On most days, she was the sweetest person you'd ever meet, but she had a short temper and knew how to cut deep. And I was a product of her. But the difference between us was an imbalance of power. She owned my world and had the power to take it away, while I simply lived in hers. So I swallowed those wounds because I needed her. Without the proper support, guidance, or resources needed to address unresolved or ignored traumas, we lack the ability and language to identify our emotional needs. And in the environment in which we came from, it was always expected for you to just get over it. So instead, we acted out the emotions we otherwise either weren't allowed or didn't know how to express in a healthier way. Let's get into Heart and Mind's toxic love affair. Once we reach a certain point of independence or have enough of what we need from that underground level, we move to the next one, psychological needs. This is where our personality drivers, the habits, instincts, and survival skills learned at the basic needs level are used to navigate adulthood and where our personalities come to life, subconsciously in search of whatever it is we didn't get from our foundation. The thin line between basic and psychological needs is control. Though I had the physical discipline to get things done in order to survive, I lacked the emotional discipline and know-how to nurture relationships in a healthy way to fill my belongingness and love needs, which is the first stage of psychological needs. This was mostly due to the use of emotional manipulation for gain growing up. I didn't know much about it at the time, but emotional manipulation is basically pulling on someone's heartstrings or taking advantage of the love they have for you to get what you want without concern of how it affects the other person. I was in search of something to fill the hole in my heart and to hold me together after losing the biggest part of myself. According to psychologist and researcher John Gottman, who we attract and how we choose mates may be either hormonal or the potential result of how we received or were deprived of love, intimacy, and security from our parents or primary guardians growing up. This theory of imprinting may also influence an individual's relationship attachment style. Psychology recognizes 4 primary attachment styles: secure, which is a stable love; anxious preoccupied, which is an unstable love; dismissive avoidant, which is an absence of love, highly reserved, or a distant love; and fearful avoidant, which is a fearful and or painful love. In childhood, we may inherit any one or more of these based on the attachment styles of our parents or primary caregivers, as they are our first teachers of love. Eventually, this can become our subconscious blueprint for how we attract and select romantic partners who fit our idea of love. I had an anxious preoccupied attachment style due to growing up in an emotionally unstable environment. People of this style tend to feel more nervous and less secure in relationships. They tend to have relationship stressors such as neediness, possessiveness, jealousy, control, mood swings, obsessiveness, etc. People with this style usually require constant stroking of love and validation to feel secure and accepted. They dislike being without company, they struggle being by themselves, and usually have a history of emotionally turbulent relationships. After a rocky home life between middle school and college, primarily due to financial stress, I joined the military for security and some level of stability, so that I didn't have to worry about depending on any one person for shelter or anything else in life who had the power to take it away because they weren't in a good mood. My foundation plus the military gave me a good enough starting block to move from basic to psychological needs. But as I stated in a previous episode, solving my financial stress only revealed underlying emotional and behavior issues that had been covered up by the academic achievements and strong work ethic as a kid. But now, those issues had surfaced and were being presented as toxic behavior in my adulthood. Because I knew how to survive, but I didn't know how to love. College was a stressful time for me because of life back home. After my little sister was born, there were a couple of occasions I witnessed my mother being hurt and left unprotected by men. So at 13, I assumed the role of the man of the house by becoming our self-appointed protector to take care of my mother and sister. During college, my mother was having some health issues, our house kept getting broken into, and money was even more of a stressor. The brokenness of my heart and empathy for my mother's continuous struggles weighed heavy on me because I felt like I was the only person who could save her. Nobody else cared enough about the things we were going through. I thought about dropping out of school for a semester or two to be back home full time, but the job I had through my school was how I was able to relieve some of the financial burden at home. Eventually, the cause of that financial stress came to light and began to take a toll on me mentally, physically, and emotionally, creating distance between me and my first love, my mother. The emotional and psychological stress I was experiencing at the time manifested itself in fast motorcycles, a lot of drinking, and abandoned relationships to deal with the emotions I couldn't identify nor know what to do with. I remember being in my dorm room sophomore year and trying to swallow a bottle of Tylenol pills. There was this deep aching pain that I couldn't find a source to, but I figured if I took enough, I wouldn't be able to feel it anymore. But after waking up with nothing more than an upset stomach, the pain was still there. At the time, I didn't consider that to be a suicide attempt. I was just trying to quiet the noise inside. Painful emotions have never been something I've been allowed to express at home. And after so many times of my feelings being invalidated or dismissed as being dramatic, sensitive, or too needy, I learned to suppress them. Eventually, I met this girl at work that I just clicked with. We could talk about anything without effort. It felt like I was talking to myself. She had opened up a part of my heart that I didn't know existed, but when I learned she was gay, it kind of fucked me up. I didn't know too much about sexuality, let alone same-sex relationships at the time. All I knew was I had been taught that it was wrong and that it was a one-way ticket to hell. I was in a battle between the heart and mind because even though I was taught it was wrong, it didn't feel that way. People were so concerned about my sexual orientation when sex hadn't even crossed my mind. It was the safety and security of being accepted for who I was and finally having someone to turn to whenever my world became too much to bear that I was attracted to. Because until then, I didn't have anyone else to turn to. I had experienced intimacy for the first time. Most people think intimacy is about sex, but it's actually about truth and trust. It's an expression of mutual vulnerability, openness, and the ability to share the deepest parts of your soul, knowing that you are safe with the other person. It wasn't something I had with my family because growing up in survival, we had a false sense of security. And in that world, vulnerability is a weakness, and trusting the wrong person can be the difference between life and death. And we didn't trust each other with those pieces of ourselves. So with all the stress I carried from everything happening back home, my friend became a place of comfort and peace. But I came from a place of devout Christians, so it didn't matter how safe or comforting she made me feel. Wrong was wrong. Long story short, I was abandoned by my family and by one of my closest friends for choosing to maintain a relationship. Apparently, I had committed the ultimate betrayal. It was at that time I learned that it didn't matter who it was from, but love came with conditions. Throughout the years, I'd grown used to my mother's turbulent emotions and overreactions to seemingly small situations. It was just who she was. We'd argue and fight, take some time apart, and then come back together like nothing ever happened. But each time took something away from me, and this time, it took away my entire world. The anxiety I felt throughout my childhood and adolescent years of my floor being pulled from beneath my feet had finally come to fruition, and I fell hard. I spent a few days sleeping in my car until my best friend convinced her grandmother to let me sleep on her couch until I left for the military. I didn't know it at the time, but those sequence of events, built on top of the core belief that I already carried from childhood that I wasn't good enough, would create abandonment issues and an anxious attachment style that would have a significant impact on every relationship I had going forward, including the one with myself. Eventually, my mother resumed our relationship as if nothing ever happened. Even though I was used to this cycle, things didn't quite feel the same in my heart this time. The day I left for the military, she snuck a picture of herself in the dashboard of my car with the words "I love you" written on the back. For her, that was all it took for everything to go back to normal and nothing else needed to be said. But for me, I could no longer make sense of those words. Love had become a condition of my self-worth. And according to my parents, I wasn't worth much because I was disposable. Research suggests emotional immaturity is the result of getting stuck in emotional development due to trauma. We grow physically, but our emotional growth is effectively stunted. Psychology today suggests people with unresolved trauma are always preparing for the next attack or life-altering event. After trauma, the sympathetic nervous system, or our fight or flight response, remains activated, keeping the body and mind on high alert, causing the brain and nervous system to become stuck in trauma and rewired in a way that makes healing a challenge. In other words, trauma has the ability to alter our personality. Psychology professional Dr. Eva Melanowski explains it this way. Getting stuck happens when you did not receive enough feelings of love and security while you were going through the traumatic events. You felt terrified, lost, humiliated, ashamed, guilty, small, and there was no one there who comforted you or showed you that they were on your side. So it started to feel too scary to continue to take those emotional risks necessary for future growth. You experienced deep hurt and fear, and no one was there to help. You began to create a protective shell around you, especially around your heart. And while your body grew, the shell hardened from more painful experiences that you didn't get any support from. As you got older, it became more constricting, and your inability to cope with life in a healthy manner became more evident. Trauma differs from one person to the next because it's a personal experience. After that experience with my mother, a shift happened inside of me. It was like a piece of my soul went missing, and I was an addict for my mother's love. So when it was gone, I sought comfort and support in relationships that mirrored what we had. And when my best friend gave me a home, she became my new superhero. I held on to her like my life depended on it, feeling indebted to her for seeing something worth saving. I kept going back to the people who hurt me most because those were the people who said they loved me, and that's what I needed. I tried to atone for my sins or my inability to be loved by loving other people harder, thinking if I loved them hard enough, they would see my loyalty and would give me a pass when I didn't have the strength to hide who I really was. And that type of love was exhausting. Nevertheless, I convinced myself that I was just being sensitive and dramatic about the situation. What was there really to talk about? At the end of the day, everybody needs their mama, and I was fortunate to still have mine in this life. So eventually, the incident became a suppressed memory, serving as a seed of resentment I would try to cover by showering her with the love I desperately needed, begging her to finally see all of this pain that I was in. The situation obviously had a significant impact on the relationship with the girl from work. I couldn't give her what she wanted because I wasn't sure what I wanted. And according to the world, the salvation of my soul was at stake. And I wasn't 100% sure I wanted to risk something like that on something that had the potential to end. Needless to say, it was a painful experience overall, and though I had my mother back, I felt empty again. But this time, the emptiness was deeper because I knew what it was like to have intimacy and what it was like to feel safe. But now, that had been taken away. After military training, my first duty station was in Boston. It was a really tough time for me being in a new city 800 miles from home where I didn't know anybody. And within the first year, I got a call from back home that my grandmother had gone missing. She was experiencing symptoms of dementia as a result of Alzheimer's disease. I felt helpless because it sounded like my mother wanted me to do something about it, but I didn't know what to do, especially all the way from Boston. Once again, the worry and stress of my home life made its way to my doorstep. Searching for comfort and a release of pressure from the weight on my heart, I was back drinking heavy and started online dating to drown out the pain. But there wasn't enough Ciroc, Bacardi, Plenty of Fish, or OkCupid dates to fill that void. I struggled adjusting to Boston culture and its lack of diversity, finding it hard to make friends. It just didn't feel like home, and I felt like an outsider, this little girl from the ghetto trying to find my way in a big world that I didn't belong. I missed the intimacy I once had, that closeness. Deep connection is what I craved from someone who understood my pain. Nothing compared to that feeling. But like the saying goes, time heals all wounds, or at least creates enough distance where it doesn't hurt as loud. One day, I was in a parking lot of work and one of my frat brothers recognized my sorority plates and we found out we were both from Detroit. So he took me in and introduced me to a small circle of people that made me feel like family, including one of my sorority sisters who eventually became my roommate. Even though me and her came from completely different worlds, she was a big part in helping me get through that time by helping me become more accepting of the parts of myself I had learned to become ashamed of. I was starting to find my way, but I just really wasn't feeling Boston. I missed Black people, I missed the hood, and I missed home. So I found the next best thing in Chicago. Chicago felt like home, and I don't mean like the home I came from. I mean, it felt like where I belonged. It was one of the only times in life I can remember I didn't feel like the weight of the world was on my shoulders. I loved my job, I loved my coworkers, and I especially loved my group of friends. It was the first time in my life I didn't feel I had to be responsible for anybody other than myself. While all of my friends back home were starting their families, I joined a co-ed flag football league where my team became my family. I wanted a family of my own, but I never felt ready. More than that, I was afraid of having a kid that would grow up to resent me, or that I would grow to resent the way I felt my mother resented me. Based on patterns in my family and my dating experiences with men, the odds of my kid growing up without a father was pretty high. And I always thought the way I felt about myself when I was alone at night was because mine wasn't there. And I didn't want to intentionally bring a kid in the world to feel the same way, because I knew from firsthand experience it wasn't a good feeling. But the friends I made in Chicago helped suppress that loneliness I felt. We did everything together. I had finally met a group of people that I could relate to. Most of us came from similar backgrounds and were at the same place in life, just a bunch of overgrown kids trying to figure it all out while enjoying all that life had to offer. Yet and still, I yearned for that intimacy, that deep connection to feel the bottomless pit inside my heart. I went on a binge of struggle love situations, guys with no jobs, no transportation, homeless, multiple baby mamas but not taking care of the babies, hidden fiancés, secret babies, men generally unavailable. I was convinced that there was an invisible sign on my forehead that read "bum niggas apply here." And I was so desperate for companionship that I took every application. Years later, I came across a Facebook status where a guy asked, why do women go for men with nothing to offer but availability and conversation? Because if he's that available, then clearly he's not getting money. In the comments, a woman wrote, because you're dealing with codependent women with attachment issues. They just need somebody to be there. I had to look around to see if this woman was standing behind me because it hit a little too close to home. But I couldn't even get offended, because at the time, I couldn't for the life of me understand why I was so attracted to struggle love relationships when I knew I wanted more. Attracted to men who had no means to make me feel safe or secure in any way, physically, mentally, or emotionally. So codependent woman with attachment issues made sense. Okay, now we was getting somewhere. It was like my heart and mind were never in the same room when it came to love. I once had a guy ask me, what type of woman was I? He said I didn't show emotion and that I wasn't like women that he knew. He said that I wasn't soft and that I was cold. He said I didn't have any feelings. The kicker is, I was crazy about him. But it was like, the more I yearned for safety, security, and intimacy, the further away I pushed it. By the time I did finally meet someone worth my time, my insecurities and emotional instability caused me to sabotage it before he could. For me, if it was too good to be true, that's because it was. I didn't trust that shit. What was he hiding? My trust issues ran deep. And because there had never been a man in my life that didn't want anything from me or who's made me feel safe, I never trusted their intentions. And I was usually right 99% of the time. Around this time, my father was calling more, wanting to work on our relationship. I knew I held a lot of anger and resentment toward him, but I really wanted to let it go. I just didn't know how, but I was willing to try. However, it eventually came out that I was just being used as a pawn for something between him and my mother. One thing I can say about my mother is she never talked bad about my father. She always told me she wanted me to have my own opinion of him and that she wanted me to know him for myself. But the more I learned about conscious decisions he made to not be in my life, the worse I felt about myself, and the less about him I cared to know. Never feeling protected and always being let down by my own father instilled a belief in me that men weren't dependable. But for whatever reason, the world thought that I should be with one. So I tried to oblige by forcing my heart into situations she didn't want to be in. Because those experiences always left me with an increased sense of emptiness and questioning my self-worth. After a few years in Chicago, it was time for me to move again. I had plans to leave the military at the time, but an opportunity to move to LA came about. And like a lot of kids from the ghetto, I dreamed of going to Hollywood to finally be seen. Still looking to fill that void, I resorted to my place of familiarity and ended up in another struggle love relationship. Dating struggling men had a distorted way of making me feel better about myself. They made me feel needed. It was the familiarity of codependent love I'd grown to know as comfort. By now, my relationship with my mother was seemingly better, but for some reason, I was still unhappy. I was attracted to toxic men because I thought I had a better chance of them sticking around. My mind knew it was a bad idea, but I didn't have any control over my heart. Without any positive male role models in my life, and based on the things I saw growing up, I'd been conditioned by society to believe I was supposed to endure this struggle part of the relationship because it was part of the building process. And if I stuck around, then he would too. As Black women, it seemed we were always expected to settle for less in hopes that it would pay off in the end. But the problem is, it usually never did. After catching my boyfriend cheating for the last time, I decided to take a break from dating altogether. I had friends telling me I was dumpster diving for love, that I had too much to offer to put up with some of the shit that I did. Maybe it didn't have anything to do with the men I dated. Maybe it was something wrong with me. The first step is acknowledging that you might be the cause of all your problems. And something had to be wrong with me because the more I lived, the less sense my life was making. This was not what I had in mind. Living in LA was the culmination of a childhood dream. So after 6 months of living there, I didn't understand the unhappiness inside that grew louder each day. Not only did I feel alone, even when surrounded by people, but I was always angry. And that anger always seemed to escalate with alcohol. I used to be pretty good at suppressing my emotions, but my attitude was getting worse by the day, and I was mad at everyone and everything without even knowing why. Every little thing triggered me to the point where I'd lash out and find myself having to go on an apology tour the next day for my behavior. An emotional trigger is anything, including memories, experiences, or events that spark an intense emotional reaction, generally greater than what the situation may call for in a moment, regardless of your mood beforehand. They're typically associated with PTSD or other mental illness such as substance abuse, eating disorders, or anxiety. I've always been told I had an attitude problem ever since I was a kid, and I've been called emotionally unstable as an adult. But I usually got a pass because I was smart and I knew how to get things done. But now, this big age that I was, my behavior and attitude was causing me to lose people who I wanted to be in my life. People I thought brought out the best in me when I couldn't see that in myself, or people that I wanted to grow with. Once again, I was having a hard time adjusting to my environment, but this time was different. Whatever this feeling was inside of me had found a home, and it was here to stay. And it was bringing out parts of myself that I didn't like nor recognize. I was starting to lose control and becoming more and more fearful of what I was capable of doing. But this part of myself would only come out during certain times. At work, I was a completely different person. Most Black people code switch at the job, but I wasn't talking about that. It was as if the person I was at work was who I was trying to become, but who I was outside of that didn't want me to or wouldn't allow me to be. There was a darkness growing inside that scared me. I thought it was because I missed my family. Since leaving for the military, I didn't get to see them much unless I went home. And even then, there was always distance between us. In LA, I was surrounded by people who had really supportive families. They flew out when they weren't feeling well, came to visit, went on family trips together. And I don't know, I guess seeing that kind of triggered my own feelings of brokenness and the disconnectedness I had with my own family. It was a painful reminder that I didn't have that, but it was something I desperately yearned for. I decided to make a big deal out of my 30th birthday and invite my family and friends to LA since most of them had never been. I figured that would lift my spirits. But even after my friends from home in Chicago came to visit, that feeling that I was feeling, it didn't go away. In fact, it got worse. I tried to ignore the fact that no one from my family came out, even though I told them about the trip a year in advance. I understood that flights were expensive and they had better things to spend their money on than a frivolous trip to LA, but also my grandmother's health was declining. Whenever I go home to visit, her condition was worse, and by now, she couldn't speak. My grandmother's health took a toll on me. I didn't recognize her anymore. And when we had to move her to a new facility due to neglect, I felt like I let her down. Growing up, she always reminded me of the promise I made to take care of her when I got older. I had become disconnected to separate myself from the pain of something I couldn't control. I wasn't in charge, and nobody had answers. Feelings inside of me were becoming harder to suppress, and I was falling into a dark space. I couldn't understand why I was having these thoughts of suicide. I shared with my mother that I thought I might be depressed. I was embarrassed by the feeling, but she assured me that I didn't have anything to be depressed about because I wasn't broke. For her, depression was not being able to pay your bills or not knowing where your next meal was coming from. I was just feeling sorry for myself and needed to go make friends. But I had friends. And no, I wasn't broke financially, but my spirit was. Nevertheless, I was living the life she worked so hard to give me. So what right did I have to complain just because I was feeling a little lonely? That wasn't a reason to be depressed. Maybe she was right. I was just feeling sorry for myself and needed to meet new people. As my behavior issues got worse and that feeling of not wanting to do life amplified, I found myself calling a hotline in the middle of the night to ask for help. They connected me with a therapist the next day, and after a few sessions talking about my relationship experiences, she told me I had something called borderline personality disorder. My toxic behavior had a name. And that brings us to the end of this episode. Just to recap, We talked about heartbreak's influence on our attachment styles and how the way we were, or in some cases weren't, loved by our parents or caregivers may be an indicator of who we attract and how we choose romantic partners. We also talked about how unresolved trauma can get stuck in the body, leaving our emotional development stunted, preventing us from moving past the traumatic experience. When psychological needs are unmet as a result of unmet basic needs, the heart and mind can become at war with one another. It seemed no one wanted my heart, and because no one else did, it made me not want it either. My mind wanted to move as far away from her as possible. She was toxic. But he was trapped inside of his body right along with her, both fighting to be seen, both fighting to be heard, both fighting to be set free. And that left my soul caught in the middle of a battle between good and evil. I knew about Heart's story, but I needed to understand mine's a little better. So next time, we'll dive into mine's story where we'll be talking about my experience with mental illness. As always, I hope you found this content enlightening, and if you learned something useful to take along your journey, make sure you like, subscribe, leave a comment, review, tell a friend and tell a friend. Just make sure you find your way back so you don't miss out on what's to come. And if you're interested in learning more, you can follow my Facebook page, First Generation Flyers, where you can find links to resources from the show and other ways to connect. Until next time, be safe, be loved, be you. Dope responsibly. Peace.
Everything and they just watch my soul.